The rain had not stopped since dawn. Thin gray sheets fell against the church windows, the kind of rain that felt like it was mourning with us. I stood at the front of St. Mary's Cathedral in Chicago, my black veil heavy against my skin, my fingers twisting in nervous circles around the edge of my coat. The coffin sat only a few feet away, polished wood catching the dim light of candles. Inside it lay Daniel Cross, the man I had once promised to love until death parted us. And here we were. For most of the people in that cathedral, it was simple. Daniel had been another casualty of addiction, another small-town boy who had lost the fight. They bowed their heads, whispered prayers, and shook mine and my children's hands as if this were a tragedy that happened to us, not a tragedy that came from him. But for me, this moment was not simple. It was a storm of contradiction inside my chest. People tell me I should feel relieved, that his overdose should be a kind of freedom, that the ghost of his anger, his manipulation, his abuse is finally gone. And yet, standing here, watching my boys, Ethan and Caleb, shift uncomfortably in their two big black suits, I felt torn in half. Because Daniel wasn't just my abuser. He was also the boy who made me laugh until I cried. The man who stayed up waiting for me when I came home late from teaching, a bowl of ice cream sundaes in his hands and that goofy grin lighting up his face. The man who would kneel on the carpet with our son Ethan and disappear into imaginary worlds, pirates, astronauts, superheroes, so convincingly that even I almost believed. And that's the truth no one wants to hear. That's why so many of us stay. Because love doesn't come in neat, clean boxes. Because the good memories don't just vanish when the bruises appear. Because the man who terrifies you is often the same man who once held you so tenderly you swore he'd never let you go. The whispers around me grew louder. Some people glanced at me with pity, others with judgment. And in that silence between prayers, I heard the question I had heard 100 times before. Why didn't you just leave? If only it were that easy. I clutched Ethan's hand, then Caleb's. They didn't fully understand why their father wasn't coming back. To them, this was just another day of confusion, another grown-up ritual that made little sense. But to me, it was the end of a story that had nearly destroyed me, and the beginning of a truth I still struggled to say out loud. Because here's what no one asks in those courtrooms, in those family meetings, in those late-night phone calls with friends. They all want to know if he hit me, if he left marks, if there were scars they could point to and say, "See? Proof." But the truth is, Daniel never did leave that kind of mark. Not the visible kind. The damage he caused was far deeper, more insidious. He left cracks in the walls of my soul, fractures in my sense of safety. He left silence in my bedroom, tears soaking into my pillow when he forced himself on me, muttering words about duty and obedience. He left me carrying shame I didn't deserve and fear I couldn't admit. And yet, at this funeral, surrounded by mourners, all I could think was this. No, Judge Keller. He didn't hit me. But does that mean I wasn't broken? I pressed my lips together, forcing myself to stand tall. My boys needed me strong. Daniel's family was here, watching, whispering about whether I had been a good wife, a supportive partner. If only they knew the truth. This wasn't just a funeral. This was the final chapter of a battle that had consumed 15 years of my life. And survival, my survival, was the only victory I had left. So I stood there, veil trembling, my children's hands in mine, staring at Daniel's coffin. My heart cracked open with grief, rage, and a strange kind of triumph. Because while Daniel's story ended here, mine was still being written. And for the first time in years, I could whisper to myself, "You lived, Sophia. You lived." Before the storms came, there was sunshine. And if I'm honest with myself, that's the part one still remember most vividly. The warmth of those first years, when Daniel Cross seemed like the kind of man every woman dreamed of. I met him on a Saturday afternoon in our small Indiana town. I was 22, working part-time at a diner just off the main road, juggling classes at the community college. Daniel walked in with 3 of his buddies after a baseball game. He was still in his uniform, a cap pushed back on his messy hair, and he had that grin that could melt anyone's defenses. He He ordered a burger and fries, cracked jokes with his friends, and every time I walked past their table, I felt his eyes linger just a little longer. When they finally left, I found a napkin tucked under the ketchup bottle with a scribbled note. "You have the kindest smile I've ever seen. Dinner next week? Daniel." I laughed, embarrassed but secretly thrilled. And yes, I went. Our first date wasn't fancy. A pizza place near the baseball field. He told me about his dreams, maybe coaching, maybe starting a small business someday. I told him about mine, becoming a teacher. He made me laugh so hard I nearly spilled my soda across the table. That was Daniel. He had a way of making the ordinary feel magical. Within a year, we were inseparable. He'd surprise me with little things, flowers he picked from the side of the road, silly notes tucked into my textbooks, midnight drives with the windows down just to watch the stars. He had this goofball energy that made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. My friends would tease me, calling him my baseball boy, but deep down, I believed he was my forever. When he proposed, it wasn't elaborate, just him, on one knee in his tiny apartment, holding out a modest ring with shaky hands. His voice cracked as he said, "Sophia, I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I promise I'll never stop trying to make you happy." And I believed him. We got married the following spring. The church was small, the kind where everyone knew everyone else. My mom cried the whole time, and Daniel looked at me as if I was his entire world. In those early months of marriage, he lived up to every promise. He worked long shifts at the auto shop, but still came home and asked about my day. He'd cook me pancakes on Sunday mornings, humming off-key songs from the radio. When I started teaching evening classes, he'd wait up for me with bowls of ice cream, insisting I put my feet up while he massaged my shoulders. He could be so tender, so attentive that I often thought, how did I get this lucky? And when our first son, Ethan, was born, Daniel transformed again, this time into the most playful, doting father. He'd crawl across the carpet with toy trucks, build pillow forts, and invent elaborate make-believe worlds where pirates battled astronauts in outer space. I'd watch them together, my heart swelling, thinking, this is it. This is the family I always wanted. But what I didn't realize then was that the same passion that made Daniel so intoxicating, the intensity of his love, the fire in his laughter, was the same passion that, when twisted, would burn me alive. Because when the storms finally came, all that charm became the perfect mask. And I would cling to the memory of those early days like a life raft, even as the water rose above my head. They say you never notice the storm rolling in until the sky is already black. With Daniel, the warning signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. At first, it was small things. A slammed door when he came home from work in a bad mood. A sarcastic remark if I forgot to put the cap back on the toothpaste. I told myself every couple argued. Every couple had bad days. And whenever I looked at him, I remembered the man who wrote me love notes and played baseball with Ethan. That was the man I chose to see. But the outbursts got louder. The first time he punched the wall, I was folding laundry in our bedroom. A shirt had a small stain I hadn't noticed before, and he exploded. His fist went straight through the drywall, the crack splitting open like a wound. I froze, heart hammering, staring at the whole inches from my face. When I whispered, "Daniel, it's just a shirt," he turned on me, his eyes blazing. "You never listen, Sophia. You don't respect me. Look what you make me do." I remember standing there, my arms trembling, clutching a basket of clothes like a shield. My first thought wasn't for myself. It wasn't even for Ethan, who was asleep in the next room. My first thought was, what will the neighbors think if they hear this? That became my pattern. Whenever Daniel raged, I didn't protect myself, I protected his image. If a neighbor knocked after hearing a crash, I'd laugh it off. Oh, Daniel just dropped something. If my mom asked about the bruise on my arm from where he'd grabbed me too tightly, I'd shrug. I'm clumsy, you know me. And Daniel reinforced that silence. Every fight ended the same way, with him pointing a finger at me. This is your fault. You push me. You make me angry. Look what you made me do. I believed him. I thought maybe if I tried harder, cooked his favorite meals, stayed quieter when he was upset, kept the house spotless, maybe then he'd stay calm. Maybe then the man who once wrote me love notes would return. But it never worked. The fights grew louder, more violent. One night in our first apartment, he swept everything off my dresser in a single motion. Perfume bottles shattered across the hardwood, glass shards glittering like ice. I remember standing barefoot in the doorway, terrified to move, knowing one wrong step would slice my feet open. The noise was so loud that our upstairs neighbors must have heard. We were friendly with them, had even shared dinner together once. But instead of fearing for my own safety, my heart raced with shame. What will they think of us? What will they think of him? And then, after the storm, there was always the calm. Daniel would apologize in the smallest ways. He'd bring me flowers from the grocery store or sit beside me in silence, his head in his hands. Sometimes he'd even cry, and I'd think, there he is, the man I fell in love with. He's still in there somewhere. But the cycle never ended. One evening, when Ethan was about 2, Daniel came home late, smelling of alcohol. I confronted him timidly, asking if everything was okay. His response was to slam his fist onto the kitchen table so hard that the plates rattled. Ethan startled awake from his nap and began to cry. I rushed to scoop Ethan into my arms, shushing him, rocking him, whispering, "It's okay, baby, it's okay." But inside, I knew it wasn't. Not anymore. Because Daniel's rage wasn't just directed at me anymore. It was seeping into every corner of our home, touching the people I loved most. And yet I stayed. I told myself love was supposed to be hard, that every marriage had struggles. I remembered the laughter, the ice cream sundaes, the pillow forts, and convinced myself that if I just endured, those days would return. But deep down, in the quiet hours of the night, lying awake next to his sleeping body, I knew. The man I had married was fading. And in his place, a stranger was taking over. This is the part of my story I used to bury the deepest. The part one told myself I could never say out loud. Because people want clear lines when they talk about abuse. They want bruises they can see, bones they can count, scars they can trace. But the kind of scars Daniel left, they were the kind that lived in silence. In the bedroom, I didn't have a name for it back then. I thought it was just marriage. I thought it was just my duty as a wife. That's what Daniel always called it. There were nights when I was exhausted from work, from caring for Ethan, from keeping the house in order so Daniel wouldn't explode again. I'd climb into bed just longing for rest. And that's when his hand would reach for me. I'd whisper, "Not tonight, Daniel. I'm so tired." But his hand wouldn't stop. His voice would grow sharp. "Don't start this, Sophia. Don't make me angry." And then the guilt would wash over me. What if saying no triggered one of his outbursts? What if Ethan woke to the sound of another fight? So I'd go still. I'd let him take what he wanted. My body would remain beneath him, motionless, while my mind drifted far away, counting cracks in the ceiling, clenching my teeth until it was over. Tears would slip into my hair silently, because even crying felt like it might anger him more. When he was done, he'd roll over and sleep soundly, and I'd lie awake in the dark, hollow, wondering if this was what marriage was supposed to be. I didn't know then that what I was enduring had a name. Marital rape. I only knew that every no he ignored carved another wound inside me. And every time I stayed silent the next morning, pouring his coffee, pretending everything was fine, I felt myself disappearing a little more. What terrified me most wasn't the violence itself. It was how normal it became. How I trained myself to smile through it, to keep the peace, to protect Ethan from knowing. Because if I could just hold on, if I could keep Daniel happy, maybe things would go back to the way they used to be. But deep down, even in those nights of silence and tears, I knew the truth. The man I had married was gone. And what remained was someone who saw me not as a partner, but as property. By the time I was 8 months pregnant with our second child, Caleb, Daniel's temper was a storm I lived under every single day. His moods shifted like the wind. One moment, he'd be joking with Ethan about superheroes, and the next, He'd slam a cabinet door so hard it nearly splintered. Pregnancy had left me swollen and exhausted. My ankles ached, my back throbbed, and I could barely sleep. All I wanted was peace in those last weeks before Caleb arrived. But instead of peace, I found myself tiptoeing around a man whose rage was growing more unpredictable by the day. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup, Daniel paced behind me, muttering under his breath. I could feel his energy vibrating through the air like a live wire. His face was twisted, his breathing heavy, his fists clenching and unclenching. I tried to lighten the mood, forcing a shaky laugh. "What is wrong with you tonight? Do you need rehab or something?" I meant it as a joke, something to break the tension. But my words hit him like a lit match tossed onto gasoline. He froze, then slowly turned toward me, his eyes black with fury. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, dangerous. I swallowed hard, my hand tightening around the spoon in the pot. My heart pounded so loud I thought he could hear it. But something in me, maybe the hormones, maybe years of suppressed anger, snapped. "You heard me," I whispered. "Do you need rehab? Because you're acting insane." That was when he raised his hand. High above his head, his palm open, his muscles taut, ready to strike. Time slowed. I could see every detail of his face, the veins in his neck bulging, his teeth bared, his nostrils flaring like some wild animal. And for the first time in years, I didn't cower. I didn't beg. I lifted my chin, placed both hands protectively over my belly, and said, "Go ahead, hit me, do something that leaves a mark." The words left my mouth before I even thought them through. Daniel froze. His hand trembled in the air. His chest heaved as if he were fighting himself, his rage warring with the reality of what he was about to do. For a moment, I thought he would strike anyway, that I would collapse onto the floor, 8 months pregnant, bruised and broken. But then he stopped. He lowered his hand slowly, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His eyes still blazed with fury, but something in my defiance had cracked through his madness. We stood locked in that silent standoff, my heart racing, my knees weak. Finally, with a guttural growl, Daniel stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the front door so hard that the walls shook. I collapsed into a chair, my whole body trembling. My hand pressed against my belly, where Caleb kicked as if sensing my fear. In that moment, I realized something terrifying. Daniel's violence had reached its peak. And if he had struck me that night, if I hadn't dared him into hesitation, I don't know if I, or Caleb, would have survived. That was the first night I truly understood. My love for him was no longer enough to keep us safe. But even then, I stayed. Because that's what abuse does. It convinces you that leaving is more dangerous than staying. It convinces you that love means enduring, that hope means sacrificing yourself. Still, deep inside me, a seed had been planted. A seed of defiance. A seed that whispered, "You don't have to live like this." It would take time to grow. But that night, 8 months pregnant, staring at the door he had just slammed, I finally knew. Someday, I would leave. Caleb was barely 8 weeks old when Daniel first entered rehab. Ethan had just turned 4. I remember buckling the boys into their car seats, driving him to the facility, and trying to believe this was a turning point. I stood there holding the baby carrier, Ethan clutching my leg, as Daniel hugged me goodbye with tears in his eyes. "I'm going to get better for you. For us. For the kids." I wanted so badly to believe him, but the day he got out, he relapsed. That very night, within 24 hours, he was checked into another program. And this time, instead of apologies, I got blame. He called me from the rehab payphone, his voice slurred, sharp, cutting through the receiver. "This is your fault, Sophia. If you were a better wife, I wouldn't need the drugs. If you loved me enough, I'd be fine. What are you going to do to fix this?" My voice shook. "Daniel, I can't fix you. You need to." Click. He hung up. The next day, I found out he'd removed me from his contact list at the center. They weren't even allowed to give me updates. He had cut me off completely. That's when something shifted in me. Not because I stopped caring about him, but because I realized my boys and I were not safe. His spiral wasn't just his anymore. It was dragging us under too. At night, I'd rock Caleb in the nursery, humming lullabies, tears streaming silently down my cheeks. Ethan would toddle in and ask, "When's Daddy coming home?" And I'd force a smile, kiss his head, and whisper, "Soon, sweetheart. Soon." But inside, I knew soon was a lie. Daniel's absence wasn't peace. It was another kind of storm. Phone calls demanding money, sudden withdrawals from our joint account, unpaid bills piling high. Even when the court ruled I wasn't responsible for his debts, he found ways to drain me dry. I was exhausted. But worse than exhaustion was the realization. My sons were learning what it meant to be afraid of their father. And that broke me more than anything Daniel ever did to me. The first time I stood in front of Judge Marion Keller, my knees shook so badly, I thought I might collapse. Daniel wasn't there, of course. He rarely was. He skipped hearings, blamed his relapses, left me standing alone in courtrooms clutching a stack of paperwork. That day, I told the judge about the fights, the holes in the wall, the broken glass. My voice quivered as I explained the threats, the manipulation, the forced intimacy I still couldn't bring myself to name aloud. The judge leaned back, arms crossed, and asked one question. "Has he ever hit you?" I froze. My mouth went dry. Images of Daniel's raised hand flashed in my mind. The night I was 8 months pregnant, daring him to leave a mark. "No," I whispered. I stopped him. The judge sighed, almost disappointed. "Then, I'm not sure we can classify this as domestic violence. Perhaps counseling? Forgiveness? Maybe you both need to focus on healing the family." Forgiveness. Healing the family. As if it was my job to save him. I wanted to scream. What about the glass shards on the floor? What about the silence in my bedroom? The nights of tears? What about the little boy hiding in his room because Daddy was yelling again? Do those not count? But I stayed silent, because that's what I had learned to do. When the hearing ended, I walked out of that courtroom numb. Daniel had stolen my safety, my money, my trust, and now the system was stealing my voice. Outside, I leaned against a cold brick wall, tears blurring the city traffic. For the first time, I admitted to myself, nobody was coming to save me. If I wanted safety for Ethan and Caleb, I'd have to save us myself. The final straw wasn't a single fight or a court date. It was the accumulation, the exhaustion of doing it all alone. I packed the house by myself, sorting through boxes of his things, my things, the kids' toys. Every object felt heavy with memory, good and bad. Daniel contributed nothing. Not financially, not emotionally. Even when the court ordered child support, he found ways to avoid paying. I worked 2 jobs, cared for 2 children, and spent sleepless nights calculating how to keep us afloat. I fought the bank to close our joint account after he drained it again and again. One night, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills, Caleb crying in the crib, Ethan curled beside me on a chair. My hands shook as I held my head in them. That was my breaking point. I sold the house. With the money, I packed what little we could carry and moved us to Chicago. It was terrifying starting over in a new city. But as I drove away from that Indiana town, a strange thing happened. I felt lighter. For the first time in years, I could breathe. People always ask, "Why didn't you just leave?" The truth? I didn't leave because of the abuse. I left because of the drugs. But I stayed free because I finally chose myself and my children. That choice became my revenge. While Daniel spiraled in and out of rehab, I built a new life. Ethan started kindergarten in Chicago. Caleb took his first steps in a small apartment I paid for myself. Every little victory felt like defiance. I got promoted at work, made new friends, and eventually, love found me again. Not in fiery chaos, but in gentle steadiness. Michael Hayes was everything Daniel wasn't: patient, kind, present. He treated Ethan and Caleb as his own. He showed me love wasn't supposed to hurt, that family could mean safety instead of fear. And that, more than anything, was revenge. Not screaming at Daniel, not fighting him in court, simply living a life so whole and peaceful that he could never touch it again. 2 years later, the phone rang. Daniel was dead. Overdose. I sat on the floor of my Chicago apartment, the receiver slipping from my hands. Ethan played with toy cars nearby. Caleb toddled across the rug. I wept, not just for Daniel, but for the man he could have been. For the father my boys would never have. For the hope I had clung to for too long. At his funeral, I stood in black once more. People whispered that I must feel relieved. But grief doesn't work like that. I had loved him once. And part of me always hoped he'd recover, walk back into Ethan and Caleb's lives, and prove me wrong. But he never did. So no, Judge Keller. He never hit me. But does that mean I wasn't abused? Abuse isn't just bruises. It's shattered picture frames, holes in the walls, empty bank accounts. It's the silence of a woman lying still while her tears soak the pillow. It's children learning to flinch at the sound of their father's voice. And sometimes, revenge isn't loud. It isn't a courtroom victory. It isn't even seeing your abuser destroyed. Sometimes, revenge is quieter. It's survival. It's Ethan smiling at his 5th grade graduation, Michael's hand steady on his shoulder. It's Caleb learning to ride a bike without fear. It's me laughing again, really laughing after years of silence. That's my revenge. Not Daniel's death. Not the ashes of the past. But the fact that I lived. I chose myself. I chose my children. And we are free. This was my story. A story of abuse, survival, and the kind of revenge that doesn't need fists or flames. The kind of revenge that comes when you build a life so strong, the people who tried to break you fade into shadows. What would you have done in my place? Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, true stories of resilience and revenge.